In Tolkien's universe, lifespans are described in lots of detail. Elves were functionally immortal, dwarves would usually live to around 250 years, hobbits would often live to 100, regular men to 80, and those of Númenórean blood anywhere between 100 to 400, depending on where and when they lived. And then there's orcs. Tolkien does actually give us a rough estimate for how long orcs lived, but there's a lot of stuff in his writings that cast suspicions on that statement. So in this video, let's ask the question, how long did orcs live? So if you're wondering where Tolkien definitively states the lifespan of orcs, he does so in the Myths Transformed section of Morgoth's Ring. They could be slain, and they were subject to disease, but apart from these ills they died and were not immortal, even according to the manner of the Quendi. Indeed, they appear to have been by nature short-lived compared with the span of men of higher race, such as the Edain. There you have it. They apparently lived shorter lives than men. Case closed. But Tolkien's answer here kind of just opens up more questions, because this is a doyalist statement, it's made outside of the universe. It's Tolkien himself giving some background information about something he invented. But in universe, it's a different story, because there's a decent amount of evidence that goes against Tolkien's own statement. There's evidence that straight up confirms that orcs can live longer, or at least raises legitimate questions. While I think there can be some reconciliation between Tolkien's statement and some of the evidence, a lot of it I'm less confident about. Okay, let's start. First question, if orcs are corrupted elves, then how come they die of natural causes? Because one of the primary attributes of the elves is their immortality, and if orcs are corrupted elves, how come they didn't inherit this? This is never truly explained. If we're treating the elven origin as fact, then there's a couple of explanations, but none are really backed up by evidence. One is that Morgoth managed to corrupt the elven Fëa, the spirit, in such a way that it was no longer immortal, and therefore completely separate from an elven spirit. This is a convenient way around Morgoth creating life. He didn't create new life, he just corrupted old life until it was completely different. And it would explain away the problem of orcs potentially appearing in the halls of Mandos. But my problem with this theory is that there isn't anything that indicates that Morgoth could alter a spirit in such a way. In fact, Tolkien explicitly states that destroying or dominating a spirit, unwillingly, were beyond Morgoth and Sauron's powers, so corrupting a spirit so badly that it became something else, I'm kind of iffy on that. Another possibility is that Morgoth didn't corrupt the spirit, but rather the Hroa, the body. I mean, he clearly did this because orcs looked very different from elves. But maybe he managed to do so in such a complete way that while orcs retained an elven spirit, their bodies were so corrupted that it couldn't house their spirit for long at all. Basically, an extraordinarily quick version of an elf fading. So a long-lived orc wouldn't die the way that we see it, but would simply fade from existence. But once again, while this might have been theoretically possible, there's no real evidence for it in the story. I'd say the most reasonable explanation is that Tolkien wrote that statement with a different origin in mind for the orcs, because remember, orcs had multiple origin stories across Tolkien's writings. They were meant to be made out of rock and mud, they were corrupted animals, they were corrupted elves, and they were corrupted men. While corrupted elves is the one that fits most easily into the tale and the timeline, and is the explanation that appears in the Silmarillion, it definitely wasn't the origin that Tolkien was leaning towards to the end of his life. For Tolkien, it was the mannish origin, and a crossbreed of men and orcs do appear in the Lord of the Rings. So yes, it's rather difficult to bridge the gap between orcs having an elven origin, yet also having lifespans that are shorter than men's. Unfortunately, that means that unless you subscribe to one of my no evidence theories that I spoke about just before, then this is just one of those many inconsistencies across Tolkien's work as a consequence of having so many changing ideas over a 50-year period. But there's another compelling piece of evidence that's completely unrelated to the origin story of orcs, and that evidence is Bolg, an orc chieftain of Gundabad. Now, when Bolg was killed at the Battle of the Five Armies in 2941, he was at least 142 years old. How do we know this? Well, he's described as being the son of Azog, who was killed in 2799 at the Battle of Azanul Bazaar. So logic would dictate that Bolg was born, or at the very least was conceived, before the death of Azog. Now, Bolg being older than 142 and still being capable of leading an army into battle, kind of puts a bullet in Tolkien's statement that orcs live shorter lives than the Edain, who rarely lived beyond 100. So how do we explain Bolg? I'd say there's two possible explanations. One explanation is that when Tolkien meant the Edain, he was actually referring to the Númenóreans who were descended from the Edain. After all, he does use the term high race. If that's the case, then yeah, assuming Bolg is an average orc and that he's really old by this point, he would in fact have a shorter lifespan than a Númenórean, and many of their Dunedain descendants who usually lived between 200 to 400 years. But then, if this is what Tolkien meant, then why not simply say Númenórean or Dunedain and spare us from the confusion? And also, by the time of Bolg, there were very few men living as long as he was. Another explanation is that Bolg, and Azog before him, might not have been regular orcs, and therefore were not subject to having a lesser lifespan than men like other orcs. There is actually a possibility of this because directly below his statement about orcish lifespans, Tolkien brings up the concept of a Boldog. For clarity, the last point in the passage you are about to read refers to orcs not being immortal. This last point was not well understood in the Elder Days, for Morgoth had many servants, the oldest and most potent of whom were immortal, belonging indeed in their beginning to the Maiar, and these evil spirits, like their master, could take on visible forms. Those whose business it was to direct the orcs often took orcish shapes, though they were greater and more terrible. Thus it was that the histories speak of great orcs or orc captains who were not slain, and who reappeared in battle through years far longer than the span of the lives of men. I'll say with 100% certainty that Azog and Bolg weren't Boldogs themselves, but they may have been descended from Boldogs, so a Maiar in the shape of an orc deciding to have children with a regular orc. Lovely. By the time of the Third Age, the Maiar blood of these orcs would have been watered down a lot, but perhaps some gifts such as a longer lifespan remained. This is really the only explanation I have without getting deep into conspiracies, such as Bolg is not actually the son of Azog. The unfortunate out-of-universe explanation here is that Azog and Bolg were first conceptualized in The Hobbit, and The Hobbit was originally written as a standalone story, separate to the Silmarillion and before The Lord of the Rings. Thus, there's a lot of things in The Hobbit that don't really make an appearance in the rest of Tolkien's writings. Giants, talking handkerchiefs, and an orc living for over 140 years. When Tolkien got around to fleshing out the Third Age, he couldn't really get around Bolg having such a long life without either changing his origin or changing the timeline. So, how long did orcs live? Well, like Tolkien said, shorter than a man, perhaps only up to 60 years. If they were of elvish origin, then clearly their immortality got lost in the process of corruption. If they weren't of elvish origin, then it doesn't really matter. Unless we're talking about Bolg, who clearly did live much longer than regular men. So either Bolg was special, or Tolkien meant something different than what he wrote. How do we reconcile all of this? We can't really. That's why it's a Middle-earth mystery. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed it or at least found it interesting. For all of the time Tolkien spent on lifespans in his universe, it's funny how there's some easily noticeable outliers. Bolg is just one. Another hilarious one is Dwalin, the younger brother of Balin, who apparently lived to 340, which is 80 years longer than any other dwarf. Whatever Dwalin was doing, it was clearly working, or maybe it was just a typo. Cheers, farewell, and remember, a half-dwarf, half-orc would be called a dwark.